but I'm really, really pleased to welcome James Poulter to the stage here. James Poulter is the founder and CEO of Vixen Labs, one of the UK's leading voice technology companies, and is a thought leader and speaker on innovation culture, the future of work and emerging technologies. James spoke last year at Stronger 2021. It was such a treat and an inspiring talk. We're really excited to welcome you back, James. How are you doing today?
Thanks. Yeah, very well, Matt. Nice to see you. And thanks everyone for dialing in, tuning in wherever you are. I'm broadcasting to you from my very foggy house and home office in Surrey. And it is, about -3 degrees outside. So I'm glad to be in here doing this.
James, looking forward to hearing your talk on the Metaverse. The floor is yours. I'll hand over to you.
Oh, great. Well, thanks so much. Well, Matt, nice to see you. Thanks everyone again, as I say, for dialing in. For those of you that don't know me, I'm James Poulter. And as Matt said, I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders here at Vixen Labs. And I'm going to be talking to you a little bit this morning about or whenever you're watching this, perhaps on the replay, about the idea of the Metaverse. But maybe just a couple of words about me. So as I mentioned, I'm the CEO at Vixen. We're a voice agency. And you might be like, well, what does that mean? It means that we work with brands and businesses around the world to help them engage with conversational technologies, and particularly the technologies that you use your voice to control, or that you type and talk to on your devices around your home and out in the world. And if you want to connect with me during this talk or afterwards, I'd love it if you did that. You can find my social handles there for Instagram, Twitter, and most other places below. And obviously also reach out on LinkedIn as well, and places like that. That's where I tend to put most of my content, and would love to connect with you. If you want to find out a bit more about Vixen, just a quick word. So yeah, we're Europe's leading full service voice agency, and we work with a bunch of different brands and businesses around the world, helping them really leverage this technology. A team of about 30 of us based here in the UK and Germany, and great opportunity, I think, to bring a little bit of this thinking about the metaverse to you, because it really aligns with our vision and mission of what we're trying to do at Vixen, which is to really help brands and businesses, organizations, churches, organizations of all types, really have better conversations with one another, that we can help them create more human connections. I think we've all experienced over the past decade, really, since the kind of advent of Web 2.0, social media particularly has changed the way in which we think, the way in which we live, work, play, and the way in which we do community and communion with one another as God's people. And so one of the really important points that I want to pull out in this talk today, as we talk about entering the metaverse and maybe why Web 3.0 is going to try and eat everything else, is to really dive into this idea of what voice and what technologies like the metaverse could mean for us in the future, because it really could be quite transformational for the good, and potentially some issues coming with it, as we've seen with other technology revolutions in the past. So that's our topic for this morning, and I hope you'll enjoy engaging in it. Obviously, welcome for those of you that are watching online to obviously raise questions, raise chat, and all that kind of stuff as well, and love to talk to you more about this. So let's dig into the metaverse. But first, maybe let's just take ourselves back a little while to kind of business travel of all sorts. It's something that I used to do a lot of before we started this whole COVID pandemic life. 2 years ago, actually 2 years ago this week, I was heading out to the United States. I was going out for meetings, and it prompted me as I was thinking about this talk of like, well, what was life like before? I remember the first real kind of piece of business travel that I did was to Paris in the early part of my career. First kind of big agency job that I had. I was working with this company out in Paris, and a small group of us got to go out there, and they really looked after us in a way that isn't necessarily common when you're the one, when they're the client and you're the agency partner, or that kind of dynamic. And they really looked after us. They put us on first class Eurostar. They put us in a beautiful hotel in the center of Paris. And when we were done after the first day of consulting and talks with them, Gerard, who was the lead there, not his real name, who I best can probably describe as the cross between a kind of front of the French rugby team mixed with a kind of bulldog, that kind of vibe. He really welcomed us to come and spend the evening with him, and he said, why don't we have dinner on my boat. And we said, okay, great, that would be very exciting. And so he took us down to the Seine, and we were loaded onto the back of this beautiful yacht, moored there in the river, in the center of Paris. And we were asked, for if we wanted drinks and champagne and dinner, and it was beautiful. It was a lovely time. And then after we had finished eating stationary, we were then going to go off for a little ride in the boat down the river. And so the guys that were serving us on the boat and working on the boat, they began to unlash all of the fixtures of the boat down both sides. And they kind of unlashed this thing, and then Gerard pops up from in the front seats and says, okay, it's time to go, and throws down the throttle on the boat, and we begin to cruise out into the Paris night sky. And it's beautiful for a second, and then we hear this clunk, clunk, clunk down the left-hand side of the boat. And I turn, I begin to see these kind of pieces of wood splintering out of the boat next to us, and the metal poles diving into the river, and a small Frenchman jumping out of the boat next to us, screaming something in a language I couldn't understand. And it became very apparent very quickly that we hadn't unlashed the boat from the left-hand side, and we were still attached to the boat that was next to us, and we were ripping these pillars out of the boat next to us. And as they began to splash into the water, Gerard, he's kind of this very bullshy kind of figure at the front. He looks around, and all he says is very simply, do not worry, we will deal with it tomorrow. Now, that accent may get me cancelled in certain places on the web, but you get the gist. We'll deal with it tomorrow. That was his attitude. And I think as we go into this new kind of technology revolution, that could be our attitude to this. It's we've heard about this. This is a topic that I've heard. Maybe I've heard buzzwords around this topic of the metaverse, right? And our attitude could be, well, we'll just deal with it tomorrow, won't we? It's not going to be affecting us today. It's not here and now. And I'm here to talk to you this morning, not to say that it's good and not to say that it's bad, but it is here. And that's not something that we can ignore. And I think typically as the church, we've often taken this attitude to new technology revolutions. We've seen new things come in and either had an attitude of fear, and with that fear comes one of two responses. We do fight or flight. And I think we all know what I mean by that. We either run away from it, no, this isn't for us, it's come from somewhere else, we're not going to engage it, or we try and fight against it. And the church has been fighting a lot, I think, in the past couple of years, as we've seen with this change in behavior that we've all had to experience. That's been forced upon us by COVID-19 and the pandemic. We're still struggling with what it means to come back. We thought we were closer to it. Omicron has come along and changed that again. And we're going to have to keep wrestling with this fact that we need to find a way of coming back together. And quietly, during the past 2 years, this idea of the metaverse has begun to gain real steam. And I don't think it's any surprise that that has happened under the current COVID conditions. But it's not a new idea. Let's just kind of go back to some time. Many of you might be familiar with the book Ready Player One. And it's, again, not necessarily the best, or not necessarily the only vision of the metaverse before, but basically this concept of a 3D immersive world, usually consumed through some kind of VR, virtual reality headset, and is a place where we can all dive into and interact day to day. And what we've seen in the past is that interaction that we've had to live with has been typically one that is social in its nature. Maybe it's been around playing games, and science fiction has presented us many utopian and some dystopian, if you're a kind of Black Mirror fan, visions of what that world might look like, where we're in some kind of haptic suit, spending our time kind of in an immersive world. So science fiction has kind of given us examples. The real world has given us some examples as well. A couple of weeks ago, this video started trending on Twitter, and it was a virtual shopping experience envisioned by the folks at Walmart, the big US department and grocery store. And here in this video, you can see someone's inside their kind of virtual headset, and they are navigating the virtual aisles. They're talking with a virtual customer service assistant. They're being able to choose what they want to buy, and they're going through kind of these different virtual worlds within it. Now, this started trending only a couple of weeks ago, but this video actually isn't very new. It's actually from 2017 when this was first envisioned by the Walmart Digital Labs teams and started being shared. This is not a new piece of technology. What it is is a revisioning of what we've heard before of this idea of virtual worlds in the metaverse. Many of you might be familiar with things like Second Life and those types of platforms, which, over 10 years ago, we were seeing people trying to spend some time in these virtual worlds. And so a lot of this space has been predominantly driven by gaming, and by, in some cases, educational or heavy industry experiences. Virtual reality as a means of envisioning something that's very hard to conceive of in person. But what we're beginning to see now with this new talk of Web 3.0 and the metaverse is a move into a new technology stack. And these technologies have begun to reach kind of at least a peak level of MVP, of minimum viable product, to allow us to really engage in the metaverse as it's being talked about at scale. Now, I think this year we're going to hear a lot about the metaverse. I do not think that 2022 is going to be the year of the metaverse. There's just going to be a lot of talking about it. There are some core technologies that it's helpful for us to understand as we go into this that make up what we're talking about when it comes to Web 3.0, which is becoming more and more the common term that is being used to describe the broad metaverse, particularly made complex by the work that Facebook, now Meta itself as a company, which we're all still getting used to, and particularly Meta Quest, which is what was previously the Oculus VR product, has previously told us. So there are three core technologies. XR, or mixed reality, is probably the best way of describing that, which encompasses virtual reality, kind of fully immersive headsets, and augmented reality, which we've obviously experienced through our phones, and now beginning to see visions of what this might look like through the glasses technology and others. So mixed reality is the interface, the way in which we experience it. In the first version of the internet, we were on keyboards. In the second, we were in web browsers. In the third, we've been on glass, fingers on glass. And the third is for us to be using our eyes and ears in that experience. The second part of that stack is the logic. Previously we had programs that ran in the command line. Then we moved to many of these web technologies and living in websites and applications. Web 2.0, those apps came to live on our devices, but be plugged into and powered by the cloud. And now the third wave is artificial intelligence, which has to kind of come in to really make these experiences feel real as we live inside them. And underneath that, we're seeing an emerging use of the blockchain as a technology that's going to be quite foundational in making these experiences feel truly live and at the same time permanent. And that's we'll get into that now. So I mentioned before, the big one of the big catalysts of this in recent years has been the work being done by previously known as Oculus, now known as Meta Quest 2, which is this fully remote, fully autonomous headset product that Facebook company, now Meta, have been working on for some time. And we saw on Christmas Day that the Oculus app hit the top of the App Store charts on iOS as kind of the amount of people that were being given these devices were using them. Now, we know from previous data that Facebook have shared that they've sold tens of millions of these devices around the world. Now, that might sound like a lot, but pales in insignificance in terms of, for example, the amount of mobile phones that have been sold, the amount of even AirPods that have been sold. So just to kind of put that in context, this is still relatively early days for these products. And whilst those apps showed up on Christmas Day as being really popular, we don't have any data on how much people are spending in these apps and how much time they're spending inside these headsets. So what we have to acknowledge, though, when I mention Meta in particular, is that when people talk about the metaverse, it's important to know that there isn't one metaverse. This is not one permanent place that we are all going to be diving into, certainly right now. There are what we might call centralized and decentralized metaverses, and that is a selection of different places that we're going to have to get used to spending our time. Facebook's or Meta's Oculus and particularly their Horizons product, which is their first kind of go at these kind of virtual meeting spaces, maybe the first of these big centralized metaverses that we might come to know. But there are many others, and this is where things like the blockchain also come in. You may have heard of some of these more what are called decentralized metaverses. as these become kind of more and more prevalent. One here is Sandbox, which is a virtual world in the sense of virtual islands, landscape, which has in it kind of virtual places, which are at the moment being bought up by both individuals and corporations. And then Decentraland is another disaggregated metaverse or decentralized metaverse. And there's more of a virtual world that can be interacted with through VR and also via the desktop. And these are more like that Second Life type experiences where we're taking on some form of avatar, interacting with digital worlds, interacting with digital goods, but crucially interacting with one another in real time across distances using these VR and AR devices. Now, we're seeing this is particularly for leisure, for play, and increasingly for commerce, as we begin to see the role that NFTs, non-fungible tokens, which I'll come back to in a minute, are beginning to play in this spaces. So this is not one metaverse. There are many metaverses that we need to kind of become aware of. And you could probably use the word metaverse as quite a catch-all term in the same way that we talk about social media. So that's just a really important distinction to make. There is Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram within the world of social media, but we wouldn't say that any one of those is social media in its entirety. And the same is true of the metaverse. That is a way of looking at this new form of technology. And within it, there will be many different domains that we might spend a certain amount of our time within. Now, of course, that's not just going to be for leisure, but also for work. This is a good example here from Microsoft, which is showcasing what their future version of the Microsoft Teams platform, in this case, might look like in the metaverse. I'm sure all of us have spent loads of time in places like Teams over the past couple of years. And as you can see here, as we are also on Zoom today, it's good to see that even our virtual colleagues won't have legs to worry about either. At least they are fully dressed. So I suppose that's a bonus. But what we're seeing is that these virtual worlds are creating new opportunities to create new types of virtual spaces and experiences for us to come into in a synchronized and communal way. And that particularly opens up the real question of how we as a church, a community, and those working around the church might begin to think about interacting with this. And we've seen some people already be at the forefront of these new experiences. Here is a couple of screenshots from a recent experiment run by Life Church based in Oklahoma, or at least virtually based in Oklahoma, but here taking place in the Horizons virtual world within Facebook's ecosystem. And you can see a virtual church service happening with people arriving and talking to one another as avatars, and then actually sitting in a virtual congregation and interacting with a virtual service with the Bible being provided through the YouVersion platform, which is run by Life Church, and the Church Online platform, where they broadcast in Life Church's live services from their physical campus locations. And this is one of the kind of first examples of people entering into running, kind of virtual metaverse services in recent times. However, worth pointing out that over a decade ago, Life Church did similar experiments in Second Life, as did many other churches around the world, where they tried to hold virtual campuses and virtual services there. So this idea isn't particularly new, but the technology is finally at a point where we might actually be able to have something that is akin to a kind of in-person experience or an embodied experience in some way, but through virtual means. Now, this is in the VR world, and I mentioned that that is not the only example of what virtual or mixed reality is going to be. One of the really interesting paradigms that we're yet to see fully come to life is what impact the augmented reality may kind of bring to us and as we interact in the world, because this is also still the metaverse in some fashion. This is an example of the kind of first foray that Facebook in particular have taken in partnership with Ray-Ban with their Ray-Ban spectacles. And these are regular sunglasses, but with audio feedback in the arms, and with visual feedback, no visual feedback, but with at least a camera feed to be able to take pictures and videos as you're wandering around and get audio feedback talking to Facebook's digital assistant. Now, you might say, well, is this really mixed reality? And I would argue it is, because what we're beginning to see here is the first steps towards what we will soon begin to see as augmented reality glasses, this vision that I'm sure many of us have seen before, where we are actually being able to interact with digital objects or see digital objects in the real world. And we'll be having audio and video feedback in order to be able to interact with these. And so a few things need to come together for this type of part of the metaverse to come to life. The first is these types of devices, which are going to be controlled with our voices. It's why us at Vixen are particularly interested in them, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. It will involve digital assets that are living both in multiple and in some cases fixed locations. And then we need to have an ability for us to have these connected to the cloud and be able to talk through these devices to one another to interact with them. So we're seeing that mixed reality is going to span more than just these big, at the moment, quite clunky headsets, but also kind of come out with us into the real world through mixed reality glasses. And whilst this has been a thing of science fiction for some time, we're beginning to see actual manufacturers beginning to work on these in the near future. And we can expect to be, Mark Zuckerberg has said within the next 5 years, being able to see these types of products coming to life. From Facebook, we know from the rumor mill that Apple are working on something very similar. And obviously Google Glass was the first attempt of this a number of years ago, back in 2012, at trying to kind of do something of a similar nature. Now, this brings in another part of the metaverse, which is quite core for us to understand. And that is the role that NFTs, or non-fungible tokens, and the blockchain are going to play in this. I'm sure if you're watching, many of you will have seen before this series of ape images that have been popping up all over the internet. These are the apes of the Bored Ape Yacht Club, which at the moment is valued in the billions now in terms of Ethereum, which is the digital currency that is used for the exchange and valuing of these cartoons. And each one of them is, yes, a JPEG. And you might argue, well, why is a bunch of JPEGs so expensive? What these JPEGs actually represent are non-fungible tokens, NFTs. The non-fungible bit, meaning there is one of one. There is only one actual version of these. And whilst I am showing you a whole collection of them, you could argue, well, James, you've got them here. How are they one of ones? The proof of ownership behind them is this token element, and what makes it non-fungible is that behind each one of these tokens sits a smart contract which lives on the Ethereum blockchain. And that means that it is a permanent, disaggregated, meaning it lives on lots of different computers, disaggregated ledger. And on that ledger is a marker of who, or at least what wallet, digital wallet, owns each one of these individual smart contracts, which represents these cartoons. And this is just their physical embodiment or at least digital embodiment as this. But what makes these apes and other collections like it so interesting is the community that they bring with them. Each one of these apes, the owner then has rights to the Bored Ape Yacht Club, which is a community of owners. And now these types of characters are now being owned by pretty famous people, as well as people who are completely unknown to us, the likes of Jimmy Fallon and Snoop Dogg, through to completely unknown anonymous folks who've been interested in Web3 technology. And what this does is brings together digital collections of items that exist in individual form, one of ones. They're not, you can't just copy and paste this and say, I own it, because you wouldn't bring with it the smart contract. And so that has some really interesting kind of ramifications, I suppose, for the metaverse. Because what this means is that whilst these right now are mostly, many of these NFT projects are focused on profile pictures and collections and clubs, when we begin to think about how these things show up in the metaverse, they're going to show up in potentially things like tickets, things like access tokens, things like digital objects like clothing, for example, for our avatars and other things like that. And what that means is that we have an opportunity here to begin to think about, well, what are the digital communities and the digital assets that we might need to think about for the church and the body of Christ as when we enter into the metaverse? What types of collections are we going to see emerge? I think this is really potentially quite exciting about what we might be able to do with them. We've seen entrepreneurs like Gary Vaynerchuk create his own collection of these 500 V friends, which are these little doodles and characters that he has been creating to share with his community. And they've begun to go on to be sold for, again, hundreds of thousands of dollars in some cases, because some of them come with specific perks and rights, like one-on-one sessions with Gary, being able, if you get the podcast or the passionate parrot there he's holding up, you get access to go on his podcast once a year if you're the owner of the token. And many of them, or in fact all of them, come with access to VCon, which is the VaynerMedia, Gary's company's annual conference, which has a limited amount of tickets. And if you have one of these tokens in your wallet, you'll be able to share that. So the metaverse also incorporates not just virtual worlds, but virtual goods, or at least virtual rights. And that's where we have to really begin to think about how this might begin to impact us as a church community and a church body, because one of the big opportunities here is for us to use these access rights and tokens as a way of bringing people together in communities, perhaps individual churches launching their own tokens to bring them into groups. We know that we've got other organizations coming on today, as you'll hear from partners in the program, people like Christians in Media or Fusion, for example. We could see in the future, people being issued virtual tokens as a means of membership into some of those organizations that will come with future rights as well, perhaps voting rights for in communities, for example. And we could even see this being a way of doing things like church governance in the future as well, where certain, as churches become more online and more hybrid and more disaggregated, as we've seen with some of the churches around the world that have become quite disaggregated. Just this past week, it was the 100th Church of England's online service since the pandemic, and there's about 7,000 people or so that have been attending that service pretty regularly, and they now consider themselves a congregation, even though that they've never been physically located together. You could see in the future churches like that issuing digital tokens of membership and welcoming people into those virtual communities, whether they're meeting in the metaverse in a hybrid or virtual reality world, or just simply tuning into the same YouTube service every week. So these NFTs represent, I suppose, a new way of doing community, and a new way of collecting people together and assigning value or assigning rights to certain members of that community through these one-of-one non-fungible tokens, these non-replicable digital objects. Now, how will we control this metaverse? How will we as individuals show up? We've looked at avatars, and one of the big things that we're also going to see is that we're going to have real permanence in these places. I mentioned at the start that we, particularly at Vixen, are interested in the role that voice plays. Voice is going to be the control mechanism and paradigm for a lot of the metaverse. For this stuff to scale, as my friend Ian Utilli, who is one of the innovation evangelists at Bethel, talks about, is that the metaverse will not work if we're limited to the speed of fingers on keys or thumbs on screens. We need voices and our other senses to be working with us in order to be able to make this stuff scale. Because when you're in a virtual world, say you're using your augmented reality glasses, you're not going to be typing and swiping on them. You're going to need to be controlling them with your voice. And so we're already seeing a real familiarity with this. And the avatars are going to be probably the way that many of us show up. We've seen quite advanced avatar technology emerge in recent years. And this concept of deep fakes has also become a challenge, which is going to continue to be a challenge in the metaverse. How we know who one another are in the metaverse is going to need some kind of way or some kind of identity system. Now, in some of these, as I mentioned before, aggregated or centralized metaverses, things like Facebook, you're going to be using your Facebook account as a means of authentication. If it's the Microsoft one, you might be using your Microsoft email address or your email address as some means of authentication. In disaggregated communities, however, and in that kind of more decentralized web, and as many more of these metaverses appear, we're going to need means of authenticating who we are, which is where we get into kind of synthetic characters and synthetic voices, which become pretty interesting. We've been doing work at Vixen for the past year with a team based at Veritone, which is one of the world's largest audio advertising and media companies and AI platforms. And their Marvel AI technology is now able to recreate a human voice as a digital clone of your own voice, but in just as little as a couple of minutes of script. And what that means is that we can begin to actually create these entirely synthetic voices or clones of your own voice into the metaverse, so that we could potentially see people being able to do digital performances or digital services run entirely with virtual content and with virtual voices that sound almost indistinguishable from the original human voice. And this partnership, one of the reasons why we've brought these things together is because we really believe in the ethical creation of these digital voices that will enter into the metaverse. if you think about where we're going with this, we might need NFVs, non-fungible voices, because as we begin to interact in these virtual worlds, we know that the world is digital and in some form artificial. We know that the objects are also digital, but the one thing that will remain human and permanent is our voices and our speech as we speak to one another. It will be many people in different places, but the ideal is that we're in synchronicity with one another to be able to speak to one another. And this is going to be particularly crucial if we want to leverage the metaverse for things like church and for things like digital services and being able to do ministry via these platforms, is we need to be able to at least still speak to one another in them. And that's where it becomes really important that we know who we're speaking to. And our voices are one of the few things that will be left as a kind of permanent artifact of ourselves in the metaverse. So I think what's really exciting as we begin to kind of wrap up here is that this technology is coming. But like with all technology revolutions, it's neither good nor bad. It's all about how we use it and what we bring together, whether it's the devices and kind of how these devices may begin to change the way in which we interact with one another and the world around us. We need to be thinking about the guardrails that are required to make sure that they don't become more addictive or as addictive as our phones already are. When it comes to these digital assets like the Bored Apes or whatever come next as the next collections, what opportunity does that present for us as a church to create new ways of doing governance, new ways of doing rights holding, new ways of sharing content and assets so that they're protected, authenticated, and long lasting and have permanence? When it comes to these virtual spaces like Horizon, or the Microsoft example, or some of these decentralized metaverses, how will we change our etiquette and way of being with one another when we're no longer physically present, but we are in some way digitally embodied in them? And what will that mean for church services, for the sacraments, the way in which we actually do, kind of communion with one another? And finally, with digital currencies on the rise, will we need to think about how churches kind of continue to fund themselves, particularly decentralized churches where they aren't necessarily kind of bringing together people in physical locations using their kind of fiat currencies? Things like Bitcoin and Ethereum may become the predominant way in which in the future we not only kind of raise money and raise funds for our organizations, but also the way in which we transact and exchange in the metaverse as well. So hopefully that's an overview, and I'm pretty much on time. I want to just end with two quick things. One is that at Vixen, we're working on projects both in the metaverse, but also, as I mentioned before, in voice and conversational technology to try and bring these experiences to life. And we are really looking for people to come and join us on that journey. We're hiring people across the board right now, but particularly looking for developers with Node.js and JavaScript experience, for project managers at all levels, from junior project managers through to senior producers, and also for marketing managers and marketing talent who can come and help us build the brand of the business. So if you're interested in any of that, head to vixenlabs.co and you can apply for the roles that are open there. And you can get in touch with myself to kind of get more information if you want. But I want to thank you guys so much for your time and for your attention. And I hope to see you physically together at some point soon. But if not, maybe I'll meet you in the metaverse in the not too distant future. And you can find me on social media at James Poulter, or visit jamespodter.co.uk for more information. Thanks so much. And I'll hand it back to Matt.
James, absolutely phenomenal, just rammed full of information and inspiration, and just so good to hear from you, James. Thank you for sharing all that you've shared. There's I think it's a little bit silent in the chat. I think we're all just blown away by all that you've shared, and I think there's loads to think about. And if people wanted to follow up, maybe some basic level resource or further reading or videos to watch, what would you suggest?
Yeah, actually, I can really recommend. I'll grab the link for it so I can pop it into the chat for you guys if you are following on. But I particularly recommend one YouTuber who is a great resource on this, which is my friend Bex Perfect. Yes, that is her real name. And she has a fantastic YouTube channel called Nifty World, which is helping kind of unpack parts of the metaverse, but in particular the whole world of NFTs and kind of non-fungible stuff and blockchain. The link is now in the the chat if you want to follow that. So I really recommend her, and particularly her video that explains why she spent £25,000 on buying a bored ape, and why she thought that was a worthwhile investment. This is not investment advice, I'm just telling you. And as it comes to the work of within like the virtual worlds and the metaverse, highly recommend going and checking out kind of what the team at Life Church have been doing with that recent experiment in the metaverse services that they did. And I'll drop the link to that as well in the chat. But if you're listening afterwards, it's life.church/metaverse, and you can go see the upcoming services that they are running in Horizons. Of course, you probably will need an Oculus headset to engage in that, but you can also get other ways of engaging with it with an app that will run in your browser or desktop as well. So that's a good place to start.
So helpful. We just put those links in the chat. And James, we're really grateful to you for speaking on this and resourcing us and inspiring us and giving us a bit of a vision for this and painting a picture for what the landscape is going to look like and is already beginning to look like. So thank you so much, James.
No worries.
Bless you. Have a great afternoon. What are you up to?
Thanks, Matt. I'm back. Well, I was going to say I'm going back to work, but that basically means closing this Zoom window and opening a different one. So I'll be heading into that now. But I wish you guys so much, kind of good fortune with the rest of everything that's going on this afternoon, and blessings to everyone that's watching. Thanks so much.
Bless you, James. James Poulter, everyone. God bless.